I am Filip Filippou, a professor of structural engineering, who is privileged to have been a colleague of Professor Chopra's for 33 years, have learned structural dynamics from his two graduate courses, and will be conducting this conversation with him. Thank you for joining us. Anil, thanks for making time. It's a pleasure to be with you. I wanted to start by going all the way back to your upbringing in India and talking a little bit about the influence that your parents had on your character and your future endeavors.
So Philip, I grew up in a middle-class family in India. Both of my parents were educated, and they placed a lot of emphasis on education. It was clear to us that that was the most important thing to be pursued. Both of them had an important influence of me, but my mother was the one who set the standards. She told me to do the very best I possibly can on anything I undertake. And that has been my guiding principle throughout my entire life.
When did you decide to become an engineer? Was that early on?
Actually not. My father's desire was that I pursue the medical profession, and that was indeed the plan, indeed my plan. But the plan got derailed by my uncle. This uncle of mine was the youngest in my mother's family, and he was only 6 years older than I am. And he was at that time in medical school, but hated it. And he discouraged me from medicine, and I turned to civil engineering.
How did you decide at the end of your studies in India to pursue a graduate degree in the United States, and how did you manage to end up in Berkeley?
I don't know where this came from, but as a young student in India, undergraduate student in India, I had my eyes set on higher education. I had no clear idea what higher education meant, but I just wanted to learn more. So after completing my undergraduate studies in India, I applied to several universities in the United States for graduate admission. These included MIT, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign, and the University of California at Berkeley. So this was 1961. I was 20 years old. And in the spring of that year, I received a letter from the famous Professor Ray Clough offering me a teaching assistantship at the salary of $225 a month. I think it's not an exaggeration to say that this letter changed my life. But for this offer from Berkeley, I probably would have remained in India teaching, perhaps happy, but obviously not had anything close to the satisfying and exhilarating career I have had at Berkeley. And on many occasions, I have said to Ray, face to face, Ray, thank you for taking a chance on me, and I say that again today.
How did you select earthquake engineering and structural dynamics?
I worked on a small project in earthquake engineering. Under Professor Joseph Penzine's supervision, my master's research addressed a problem that was suggested by John Bloom's consulting office. As you might remember that John Bloom used to be one of the leading structural engineers in San Francisco. And his office was designing a small addition to the top of an existing building. And so they asked Penzine for advice, and Penzine suggested that as my master's topic. We computed what seemed like unbelievably large forces in that addition, that light appendage on top of the building. And those unbelievable results were vindicated a year later when, during the Great Alaskan Earthquake of 1964, there were many buildings in Anchorage which were hardly damaged or very lightly damaged, but their penthouses were destroyed. And that experience is what got me interested in earthquake engineering and launched my lifelong interest in this subject. So in 1963, Berkeley received perhaps one of the first significant grants in earthquake engineering, funded by State of California's Department of Water Resources. This project was concerned with seismic analysis of earth dams, embankment dams. Professors Clough, Penzine, and Seed were the principal investigators for the project, and this project became the basis for my PhD research. So Clough offered me a golden opportunity to work on this project.
Did you enjoy the experience of going through the research for a number of years, the resources you had at the time?
This project funded, there was enough funding to fund my stay as a PhD student. And it led to one of the earliest applications of the finite element method to dynamic analysis of continua. Using constant strain triangular elements, we formulated a finite element model, were able to compute the natural vibration frequencies and modes of the dam, stresses as a function of time. So Clough was happy with me, and Professor Seed was especially happy that I could compute the time variation of seismic coefficients on a potential sliding mass of the earth dam. And because of that part of my work, people outside Berkeley for several years thought that I was a geotechnical engineer, no matter how hard I tried to dispel that impression.
Did you always knew you wanted to become a professor?
Before coming to Berkeley, I had worked for a year in India in a company, in a consulting office. So I had some taste of what industry is. And then during my graduate student days, it became clear to me that an academic career was ideal for my interests and sense of values. And so that's what I wanted to do. As you know, I've been on the faculty for almost 50 years. For all these years, I was paid a salary to teach and research something that I enjoy anyway. I really would not trade this job for any other in the world.
And how did this amazing 50-year career start?
My first faculty position was at the University of Minnesota in Minneapolis. It's a good school, and I went there. Everything was going well, meaning I was doing teaching and research. People there seemed to be happy with me. But it became obvious pretty early that it was so naive of me to have gone there. Nobody there was really interested in earthquake engineering at that time. So I thought this is not the right place for me. So after less than two years, I resigned from this tenure track faculty position. Berkeley had just received its first $1 million grant in earthquake engineering research from the National Science Foundation. Professor Penzine, who was the principal investigator for that grant, offered me a temporary research position. So that's how I came back to Berkeley.
How did you manage to transition then to a permanent position?
So this happened in the fall of 1967. I come back to Berkeley. I work hard on research for full time for a year or so, and it turned out to be a very productive year. And that work led to 3 papers accepted for the 4th World Conference in Earthquake Engineering, which happened to be in Santiago, Chile. So this was 1969. The entire conference those days, this World Conference, was in 2 rooms. Basically 2 parallel sessions, as we would call it today, but not very large auditoriums. And in the audience were all the big names in earthquake engineering, including Hausner, Newmark, Rosenbluth. During that week in Santiago, during that conference, one evening at a restaurant, I was dining with some friends, and Bill Hall, whom you know as a famous professor at Illinois, he called me over. He happened to be in the same restaurant. And he asked me, what is the meaning of this title, acting assistant professor, that appears on the papers, on your papers at this conference. And I said to him, it simply means that my position at Berkeley is temporary. And so we had a little conversation and it ended there. A couple of weeks later, I receive a telephone call from Professor Newmark's secretary. He at that time was the head of the department at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign, inviting me for an interview. So I go there, and my host for the day was Professor Stephen Fenves. During that day, I met with several faculty members, one-on-one, as you would expect, but no seminar. I was not asked to give a seminar. At the end of the day, I was to meet Professor Newmark in his office, and during that conversation, he offered me a tenure-track faculty position.
What happened after that offer by Professor Newmark?
Somehow, the Berkeley faculty came to know that Newmark is interested in me. How they came to know, I really don't know. And, Professor Newmark was a very big name at that time. And when people like him spoke, people really listened. The faculty at Berkeley started trying to create a faculty position when none was open. And by the end of that spring '69, I had offers from the two top-ranked universities in the country.
How was it like working those days, heydays of earthquake engineering?
Working during those, as you say, heydays of earthquake engineering was truly exciting. Exciting in the sense that the field was wide open. Anywhere you turn, there were problems crying out for a solution. So there was no dearth of problems to work on. Funding was adequate. And so it was an exciting time. And Berkeley seemed like a research factory in earthquake engineering at that time. So much was happening, it was unbelievable, really.
Indeed, the pioneering times saw a lot of pioneers of earthquake engineering were also outside Berkeley. Did you have a chance to interact with any of those?
Well, a couple of them turned out to be very important in my life. I have already mentioned to you about Professor Newmark. So in 1974, I was a 33-year-old associate professor at Berkeley, get a telephone call from Professor Newmark himself. He's calling me to tell me about a new project that is starting, the ATC3 project. And the goal of the project is to develop the resource material for the next generation of building codes. And he is calling me, asking me to chair the analysis committee for the project. So I'm obviously thrilled at this opportunity, the opportunity of working with him, the opportunity of working with the entire who's who in earthquake engineering that was involved in the project. So after the call ended, I distinctly remember stopping to think, why did he call me instead of the several big names that exist here? And I would, of course, never know the answer to that question. Another person who I would like to mention is Professor Andy Valetsos. His research, writing, and lectures had a profound influence on my teaching and research philosophy. In fact, his work in collaboration with Professor Newmark was the basis for a couple of chapters in my textbook.
Let's switch now and talk a little bit about your famous textbook. I was wondering what motivated you to write the book, and in particular, how difficult a challenge it was following the early Bible on the subject by Clough and Penzine.
The Clough and Penzine book was truly it was published in 1975. It was a landmark book in terms of its philosophy, breadth of coverage, and how comprehensive it was. And the book was a major influence on all subsequent textbooks, including my own. It's fair to say that, incidentally, my book came about almost by accident. Over the years, my teaching had drifted away from the Clough benzene book, but I had never thought about writing a book. You can imagine my hesitation because Ray Clough and Joe Benzene had been such critical mentors in my life. Trespassing the same subject or trespassing their territory seemed like almost blasphemy to me. So I had never thought about writing a book. So several years after Clough and Benzene had retired from the university, my wife and daughter, they persuaded me to write a book that is consistent with my teaching philosophy. And that's how I started on that project.
What were some of the features of the book that contributed to its quick adoption in so many universities as the standard textbook on structural dynamics?
You know, it's hard for me to identify all the reasons, but if I have to do it, I would say there were two principal factors. One was that during that 15-month period, every morning when I went to my desk at home to work on this, I reminded myself that I'm writing a book not to impress anybody, but as a teaching book for students who are learning the subject for the first time. So I placed great emphasis on pedagogy, and I think that's the main reason students like the book. They find it not too difficult to learn the subject from because of the book. The second reason, somehow I instinctively decided to renew myself and start from scratch. So the notes that I had accumulated over a 25-year period, I had to somehow keep away from them if I'm going to start from scratch. And yet it was clear to me that if the notes existed on the bookshelf, I would not be able to resist the temptation of looking at them. So one Monday, that binder went into the garbage. Now, I still wonder how I managed to take that bold step, but it was a liberating event.
Did you know, however, at that time, did you have an inkling how phenomenal a success it would be? I mean, it's not just a success, a phenomenal success.
No, I honestly did not. So as I mentioned to you, I was working at home during those 15 months every day. And my wife was watching me work on this project, my wife Hamida, and she noticed that I was happy with what I was accomplishing, what I was able to do. She took that to predict that the book is going to turn out to be very good. And I kept reminding her that I can only do the best I can. The verdict will come from students and other professors as to what they think of the book. So time will tell. Fortunately, most people liked the book. Creating that book has been one of the most satisfying experiences of my professional life.
What effect did it have on your life after its publication?
Many young people now know me because of the book. In this age of easy communication, they send me emails expressing their appreciation of how the book is helping them. At conferences, young people want to take pictures with me. This World Conference, 16th World Conference on Earthquake Engineering happened to be early this year in Santiago, Chile. I was surrounded by young people taking pictures, and some of my contemporaries walked by wondering what is going on. and I said to them, you have to write a book to get this kind of recognition.
Earthquake Engineering and Structural Dynamics Journal, one of the preeminent journals in the field of earthquake engineering structural dynamics, both for many researchers and also for professionals. How did your association start and how did it evolve?
I would like to first tell you a little bit about the journal. So Earthquake Engineering and Structural Dynamics was launched in 1972 as the official journal of the International Association for Earthquake Engineering, what we call IAEE. At the time, Professor George Hausner was the president of IAEE, and they decided that earthquake engineering should have a journal of its own, and it was launched. The founding editors of the journal were Professors Clough and Warburton in the United Kingdom. And the two of them really get the bulk of the credit for setting the standards for the journal. I think it was in the mid-80s that Professor Clough invited me to join the editorial board with the understanding that after he retires from the journal, I would become an associate editor. That happened, I believe, in 1988. And several years later, when Jeffrey Warburton retired, I was appointed the editor for the journal.
Now, as far as the nature of the papers that are being published in these 45 years?
Big changes. You know, earthquake engineering is now a mature field. So it's very difficult for anybody to write a paper that is going to be a major advance. In contrast, in the early years of the journal, earthquake engineering was a wide open field with many fundamental problems to be solved. So the journal used to receive many papers which had a significant impact on advancing the body of knowledge. That perhaps has been one of the biggest changes in the journal.
What are your experience of the changes that you have?
So in addition to what I already said, a big change occurred in the 1990s when NSF decided to establish centers for earthquake engineering research. That decision resulted in the fact that much of the funding in earthquake engineering now went to the centers, hardly any left for individual researchers working with a couple of students. In passing, I want to note that this model of small-scale research, a professor working with a couple of students on an idea that they have, that model had been successful in producing the seminal research in earthquake engineering for a 40-year time span before the creation of the centers.
What factors do you think played the most important role in your successful career?
Let me first say that it is awkward to talk about success in front of people who might listen to this interview later, who are themselves so very successful. You know, many of my students have been very successful, accomplished engineers, accomplished professors, presidents and vice presidents of universities, deans of engineering colleges. In my case, success did not come because of any grand design or philosophy. My mother set the standards for me. She taught me to focus and work hard. God blessed me with great mentors and put me at the right place at the right time. My wife and daughter, who have been very supportive, created a supportive, congenial atmosphere at home. And finally, significantly, I've had the privilege of working with some of the best graduate students among the students at Berkeley. And it is because of this collection of things that I was able to do what I did.
So now that you crossed that line to retirement, what are the big plans, and will that percentage share between personal and professional change?
I'm still working on the journal, doing some research, writing. It doesn't mean that I'm working as hard as I used to, but I still keep a regular schedule. Many years ago, I think it was in the 1980s, that I noticed some of my senior colleagues, they seemed to work all the time. There are a couple of things I especially enjoy. One is I enjoy hiking. My only regret is that I started a little too late in life, but I enjoy it. So I've done such treks, in a couple of them in Nepal, in Chile, where I've visited several times, in Canada, and in Peru. So I hope to continue those things as long as my health permits. The other passion I had was Urdu poetry and Indian classical and semi-classical music. So I want to explicitly exclude Bollywood music. There was a time when I used to enjoy those things for extended hours. Somehow I have gotten out of that because of various demands in one's life. So I hope to get back to that. And I don't know whether you, Filip, or the audience is familiar with Urdu poetry, but just like Persian poetry or Farsi poetry, Urdu has a very rich poetry heritage. So if you know the language and get into it, it's one of the most enjoyable things that one can do. And I'm hoping to be able to spend more time on that.
So thank you so much for this lovely conversation. I had a good time.
Well, I enjoyed it, Filip, and I know that you have many demands on your own time, and I truly appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation with me. And I hope that anybody who listens to this conversation enjoys it as much as you and I have enjoyed it.